Okay, and where's my program though?
Okay, so now you want to share your screen.
Share. Okay, there we go. Okay, everyone, we are rolling. Now, one thing is there's a little chat thing on the right and the bottom. If you have any questions, just type them in, and then you're free to actually, and we'll cover all of them at the end of the program. So anyway, here we go. Memorial Day history and lore is very strange because it's some ways it is our most perverse holiday because even though it says it's a holiday, it's actually not quite a holiday, and not in the sense of like Independence Day or Labor Day. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about. Well, these are some of the many meanings of things like it's the first beach day in northern states like Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware. It's a 3-day weekend. Everyone's got that. And it's also lots of sales. And this is a Macy's ad. And, you see all these glossy things. And it sort of conceals what the day is really for. And so this is what we're going to do. This is what it really means. It's going to commemorate the actual ultimate sacrifices Americans made in all of our country's wars. And this is one of the things we do at this time is to put flags on veterans' graves, as you see here. Okay, now some of the activities I'm sure you know are large parades and barbecues. I've been in a few of them because I'm a son of the American Revolution and we're in great demand on Memorial Day. And of course, all sorts of barbecue type stuff. Okay, now of course, one of the things you see is a lot of veterans marching on the day. And these are some pictures showing veterans from the 19th century to the 21st. Actually, the picture at the top left, that's actually Woodland Boulevard in DeLand in 1889. The bottom left is Bonita Springs in 1947. And these on the right are disabled vets from the Iraqi war in Washington. So I mean that is a big feature of the day. All these patriotic parades with veterans marching, but there is sort of a remote uh, cloud, you could say, on the horizon, and I'll show you why. Now, but before that, these are visiting deceased veterans because every family has some veteran who died in the service of their country, and they go to visit them. And whenever possible, I always try to put in a slide to my hometown, and which was Brooklyn, New York. And this is Greenwood Cemetery, which was started before the Civil War, and it's got some really interesting things. And it's got this magnificent Gothic arch as an entrance. And basically it looks pretty much the same, except the trees are fuller and taller. But otherwise, the roadway, the arches, everything hasn't really changed much, which I think is fun. Now, this is what I was talking about, the cloud. This is a recent article in the last couple of years, this small town in Pennsylvania near Philadelphia, that in this neighborhood, they're not going to have a parade because dwindling attendance, people aren't volunteering, and general community support because they usually rely on local merchants to contribute and vary and host, have flyers and everything to promote it. So it's present is a little tenuous right now. And of course, we have a new and very unwelcome development here. This is one I just got the other day. This is a Bucks County community that has canceled its parade. And I'm sure this is being repeated all over the United States. But hopefully that won't be too serious a blow towards the future of Memorial Day. And of course, since people aren't showing up for the parades or volunteering and everything, it raises the question, if we don't seem to care much now, why did we ever? And this is why, because I mean, there has always been commemorations of the war dead as long as recorded history exists. But in this country, it was a move to make it a national observance in the United States in the post-Civil War era, because something like at least 675,000 men died in America's most catastrophic war, and it was basically 1 in 4 soldiers on both sides never returned home. And actually, I can attest to that because my great great grandfather, Daniel Poley Holder, who was from Levy County here, he was 45 when the war began, and he joined up. In fact, actually, he was the oldest of the generation of my ancestors, and he joined up. He was the first one. And he died in Chattanooga in September of 1862, and there's no record of his burial. I mean, I'm sure he was buried there, but there's just no record of exactly where. Now, this started gaining ground, and this is a colorized picture of an original print made for Harper's Weekly magazine of them decorating a statue in New York. It's actually an equestrian statue of George Washington, which sort of is interesting in itself because New York City in 1776 had the only equestrian statue in all of America, and it was of King George III. And when we heard about the Declaration of Independence on July 9th, 1776, we actually got moved to rip it down. And actually they use the lead to make weapons, bullets. And there are a few pieces that are actually still in the collection of the New York Historical Society. And so something about 80 years later, they actually decided to put this equestrian statue of George Washington. And originally it was outside of the Union Square on Park Avenue, but they decided that it would probably be better in the park than in the way of traffic. But anyway, they had it was a way to accept the massive losses of the war and to recognize the sacrifices that all these young men made, which was something like 6% of the US population at the time. And so there's got to be this strong, strong need to have a day to commemorate them. And this is what we came up with. We called it Decoration Day. And this is representative of a lot of the feeling that was then. And this is a poem, and this was not written by a poet. Francis Miles Finch was actually a prominent New York State jurist, and this is actually the end of the poem. It's actually quite a few stanzas, but and he did various different variations in the last 2 lines, covered with gold, the blue, embroidered with gold, the gray. And in this case, he wrote, and love and tears for the blue, tears and love for the gray. And this shows a veteran, very sentimental portrait, but it sort of gives you the feeling of the time and why Americans were doing what they were doing. And as you see here, reconciliation rolls on. This is an 1899 Puck magazine cover, which was originally a British magazine, but they had a building here in New York City. In fact, you've seen it, because if any of you followed the Will and Grace show, Karen's office, they show an exterior of a building. Well, that was the Puck building. And so it's got 2 veterans from the Civil War in the blue and the gray, and they're standing and holding the hands of a young soldier in the Spanish-American War. And I found something rather interesting about the war. Arlington National Cemetery in Washington has more Spanish-American War veterans' graves and monuments than any other place in the United States. And this this large thing in the foreground is actually the anchor of the armored cruiser USS Maine, the ship that was blown up in Havana Harbor. And it was raised and actually became part of the monument. And just as an aside, the Maine was actually built in my hometown in Brooklyn. And they built, and that was just scores of other ships they built. Among the others they designed were the Monitor. They had the Missouri, they had the Arizona. They were all built in Brooklyn. Now, this is a rather odd quirk of this reconciliation. My great-grandfather, W.D. Holder, was the last of my family's Civil War persons to die. He almost made it to 1929, and he was born in 1846, so he had this really long life. And this is a standard issue U.S. Veterans headstone paid for by Mr. and Mrs. U.S. taxpayer. And he got a headstone, but his service was ineligible for a U.S. pension, which was like in the 19th and 20th centuries in places like Minnesota and Pennsylvania and Ohio. The idea of even giving former Confederates any sort of U.S. pension was like almost like free abortion on demand in some places. I mean, this was something that people in the North would never accept. And so former Confederate states like Florida actually gave out their own pensions. And so anyway, that's what he did. He was in what they call the Florida Cattle Guard. They rounded up free-range cattle and basically snuck them past the Yankees in Fernandina, trading a few shots on the way, I'm sure, and got them to the railhead in Jacksonville. And they literally fed the Confederacy and literally kept the war going for 6 extra months because of the food, the cattle they were moving. So anyway, in any case, he got a stone, and at the top it's got the Maltese Cross of the Confederacy. Okay, well, here we go again. Okay then, who did think this day up? And their claims, these are some of the places that claims that they invented it. Savannah, Georgia, Carbondale, Illinois, Boalsburg, Pennsylvania, and Waterloo, New York. And they all says somewhere between 1862 and 1866. And this is a picture of the Boalsburg celebration. So they absolutely have no doubts. It's very complicated. I think it seems like a lot of people had the same idea right at about the same time. And so who actually invented it, it may never be completely known. But here's some of the contestants. Here's the Forgotten Memorial Day. This is actually documented, had occurred on Charleston, South Carolina on May 1st, 1865. So that's considered rather early. And when the war ended, there were at least 257 prisoners that were in unmarked graves on a race course. And of course, there would be no racing during the war. And they were, not taken great care in their graves. They weren't marked. They were buried close to the surface. So the African American population of Charleston actually went out and they got a ceremony and they reburied the remains and everything. And so it was actually covered by the national press because the AP wire was in existence by then. And here's a picture of the graves in Hampton Park Racecourse. So they definitely cleaned it up quite a bit. Now, here's another claim that I thought was interesting. This was published in New Orleans. It was a song by Mrs. L. Nella Sweet, and it came out in 1867. And it says, "Where our loves are sleeping." And it was actually dedicated to the women who decorated the graves of the Confederate dead. And of course, that's how it started, actually. Um, but now this is possible that the Southern women might have the edge. I've seen several sources that say Savannah, Georgia has a very credible claim that dates to 1862, but in reality, there's no way we could know for sure what exactly when this happened. But it's sort of interesting to sort of figure it out. Okay, now, you know, in a way, the war didn't cease for the dead. There was so much animosity, and even during the war, uh, each side would only bury their own dead and just leave them. And of course, it was really impossible to figure out who was who, because dog tags didn't become standard issue in the U.S. Army until in 1912. So in the 1860s, it was very hard to identify someone who was dead. But so, when the Union started putting together these cemeteries, national cemeteries, they concentrated on Union dead, and it caused a lot of bad feeling in the South, because the whole war was fought there, and that's where pretty much all the cemeteries are. But so gradually, the Union got to the point where they just had to make sure they took care of all the dead. And this is the Silverdale Cemetery in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And this is where I think my great great grandfather Daniel is buried. And if you go on their website, they will confess that they don't really know for sure, who's there and who's not. Now, if you want to find out more, this is an excellent book. It's really sort of heavy going, but it's well worth looking at. It's called This Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War. Now, if you want the shorter version, we actually have a great DVD of a PBS documentary. It's called Death in the Civil War, and you'll find them both in 973, 71s. So when you can reserve them now for curbside pickup, and when we're open, you could just come and check them out for yourself. But they're definitely, I read the book and I've seen the documentary, and it really sort of pulls it together and really sort of makes it more real to us just how cataclysmic this war was, and why we had to actually have a way to express our emotion about it. Well, eventually a location was made official. Uh, and I remember this because I was 15 and a half at the time. President Johnson signed a presidential proclamation, and he named Waterloo, New York, as the birthplace. So if you're ever up in New York State, you might check out Waterloo around Memorial Day, but I'm sure you'd have to book way in advance because it's got the official imprimatur. Now, the Department of Veterans Affairs actually has a whole different thing. They give it as May 5th, and they credit the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the veterans group for the Union War veterans. Confederate veterans are sons of Confederate veterans. So there's two different lineage groups dedicated to this. Uh, Wait a minute. Said, don't we observe Veterans Day too? And so here's the distinction. And sometimes you'll see this on things, social media, Facebook, explaining all these distinctions. And Veterans Day on November 11th is to thank all veterans for their service. And that was originally called Armistice Day because that was the day the First World War ended. It ended on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour. And there's also other days. There's Armed Forces Day in May, which recognizes all who currently serve in the armed forces. There's also service days. There's an Army Day, a Navy Day. So we have quite a lot of military days. And, you know, this holiday has come into popular culture in several interesting ways. Now, this is a fairly recent movie that and it's called Memorial Day, and it says two generations, two generations, two wars, one story. I haven't seen it, but it looks rather interesting, and James Cromwell is an excellent actor. Here's a portrait called by an artist named Henry Sandham. It's the Memorial Day in Boston, and the elderly man on the extreme right holding the sword, the one closest to the children with the dogs, that is William Tecumseh Sherman. So they had some really big guns at these Memorial Day parades back in the day. Um, American composer Charles Ives, he actually created a symphonic piece entitled Decoration Day, and it expresses a young boy's excitement at a passing marching band. And he was known for his dissonance, and so it's not to everyone's taste, but it's rather interesting to listen to. Now, one thing I learned is that Memorial Day is very resonant whenever we're in another war. And this is Memorial Day for 1917. This is May 30th, 1917. We had just declared war 6 weeks before, and they were trying to sort of drum up support because many Americans were sort of understandably bewildered because President Wilson's reelection slogan the year before was, "He kept us out of war." And all of a sudden, we're in one. So they really sort of had to sell it. And Memorial Day was a good vehicle for that. And it's got, like I said, reconciliation again. It has a Confederate and Union veteran, you know, in the parade. There are Boy Scouts in front, and there's current troops. Let's see, it looks like Army, Navy, and Marines, you know, marching with the large flag behind. And this is, like I said, poppies became a part of Memorial Day, even though they were originally intended for Armistice Day. And it was actually invented by a woman, Moina Michael. She actually invented this artificial poppies, and they were inspired by British Colonel John McCrae's poem. And I say it's, you know, in Flanders fields, and oh yeah, it says the first line is, "In Flanders fields the poppies grow, uh, beyond the crosses row by row." And it was meant to be a fundraiser for disabled veterans, and they still do that today. So you'll always see them around Memorial Day. I don't know, veterans selling artificial poppies, hopefully in a socially distant way, but but that's where it comes from. That's, even though it was meant for one day, it became associated with this day. And there's even a Confederate Memorial Day because the Confederacy, they wouldn't not recognize Decoration Day at all. It was considered a normal, a northern holiday. They also generally did not recognize Thanksgiving. And so it wasn't until the early 20th century, especially when it came to represent all deceased veterans. See, here's reconciliation again. And that's how Confederate Memorial Day, they had their own day, and Florida's is April 26th, which here is not a holiday. However, in neighboring Alabama, it is an official state holiday where all government offices close. But in this state, you often find groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. They are in uniform and they place Confederate flags all on the graves. And as you see, this stone is a more modern version of my great grandfather's stone. It's got the Maltese Cross of the Confederacy, and it has his rank and his company and his date of birth and date of death, just like any veteran would have. Believe it or not, there's actually a Memorial Day monument. It's the only one outside of the United States, and it's in Edinburgh, Scotland. And it was actually dedicated to all these Scots who felt so moved in one way or another, who actually crossed the Atlantic, which in those days was about a week to 2 weeks, depending on which kind of ship you got on. And they fought in our war. And actually, in my own family, my brother-in-law, he had ancestors. One joined the Confederacy and one joined the Union. They fought the war. They got their money, and it was such as it was. And then they just went on back home to Ireland. Now, there is sort of hope for the future. We're hoping that things like new developments like blogging and social networking has the possibility to reinvigorate the day. And because it's, like I said, facing a somewhat uncertain future. And hopefully that will sort of help translate to Americans to bring it into a new age. And here's something I found to be encouraging. This is a Memorial Day blog. And this is what somebody wrote. And here we go with reconciliation. It's not about division, it's about reconciliation and to honor those who gave their all. And, it's quite a good sentiment. And as you see, this is a young man uh, on his computer. And hopefully in the future, that will actually make us keep this great holiday for future generations. Now, here's another thing from my hometown. I grew up in a neighborhood, well, it's loosely, the whole thing is called Bay Ridge, but my section was actually Fort Hamilton. We were named for the post. And so this is from a local newspaper thing. They said that it's the longest running Memorial Day parade in the country, and they needed help. See, this is about community support because they're getting less state funding and they needed money. So they're having a fundraiser for Bay Ridge Memorial Day at the Longbow Pub, where I seem to remember tipping a tankard or two back in the day. They've been around a long time, but still, it's in their 153rd year. So let's hope they keep going. And this is the end. This is Washington. And this is actually the Korean War Memorial, which is actually the latest so far to commemorate the sacrifices made. And right now, I'm actually listening to a book by David Halberstram. He's a historian, and he wrote a comprehensive. This is so comprehensive. I have 26 discs. I have never listened to a book this long. It's been taking me weeks about the Korean War, called the coldest winter. That's what it's called. And it's sort of an important book if you can ever get to it, because I understand a lot more about where the war succeeded, where it failed, and the sacrifices made in what largely was such an unpopular war when I was like an infant, and that Americans really sort of chose to forget it. So I'm putting in a plug for Korean War veterans. So definitely follow up on that. And we actually have a lot of things all about Memorial Day, a lot of things about Americans' War. So, you know, when we're up and running, you know, just check it out at the library, which you can do now and for pickup, or when we're open, you can come in and do that. So I am going to turn everything over to any questions anyone might have. So, but thank you for attending, and we really appreciate you listening to me go on and on like I usually do. So thanks again. Okay. Yeah, and
Tom,
yeah.
are are the are the were the people disinterred for the people that were buried at the racetrack?
Yeah,
Are they still there?
eventually, no, eventually, it is still a park, but it's not a race course anymore. And what
Oh,
they're
it
doing,
isn't. Okay.
yeah, and like I said, pretty much every major city in the South, like you know, Atlanta, everybody, they all have some sort of national cemetery very close by that was established in the post Civil War years. Yeah, so that's where everybody wound up. There's a very graphic picture of the Battle of Cold Harbor. It was like one of the last battles in the Civil War, and it was a Union victory. And they didn't get around to disinterring and reburying the remains for some months. So they have this very graphic picture of several former slaves who were being paid workers, and they're crouched by a litter full of human bones that were going to be reinterred.
Hi, Tom. This is
Yeah.
Ann here. I don't know if I missed it. Did you talk about when they changed the celebration day from the 30th to, I think, the last Monday? Because I chose to get married on, my wedding anniversary is on Memorial Day because it occurred on a Sunday. We had Monday off. It left everybody time to travel.
Yeah.
And then I know it was shortly thereafter that they changed it. I thought, oh, we'd be together always.
Yeah, it seemed like I remember it around the 70s that
Yeah, I was married in 71.
yeah,
So I
it was
think it was
Nixon.
2 or 3s after that.
Yeah,
What a shame.
it
2 or
was yeah,
3.
during the Nixon years, it was decided to follow Australia's lead because that's what they do, and it just seemed to be more efficient to make everything the first Monday, make it a full 3-day weekend.
Messed me up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so does anyone have anything else?
Thank you very much. It was very nice. It always
Yeah,
is. Your
thank
talks
you.
are always lovely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, you know, I'm just getting started, folks.
Looking forward to June and July.
Okay, we will see
Yeah.
you all then.
Thank
So,
you.
signing
Bye-bye.
I want
signing
to come
off.
to other classes.
Oh yeah.
Bye.
Okay. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.